Philadelphia, May 1947. A woman sits in a federal courtroom wearing a tailored suit. She is 31 years old. Her hands are folded in her lap. The charges against her are possession of narcotics. She has pleaded guilty. There is no trial. The proceeding lasts less than an hour. What is striking to anyone who looks closely at the record of that morning is not the verdict. It is the stillness. Billie Holiday does not speak on her own behalf. Her attorney speaks. The judge speaks. A federal prosecutor reads from a document. And then it is over. She is remanded to the Federal Reformatory for Women at Alderson, West Virginia, to serve a year and a day. Outside the courtroom, the press is waiting. The photographs taken that afternoon show a woman who does not look broken. She looks contained. There is a difference. She had spent the previous decade becoming one of the most recognizable voices in American music. Clubs from Harlem to Los Angeles had filled because of her. Columbia Records had built careers, other people's careers, on the foundation of her recordings. She had stood on stages beside Benny Goodman, Count Basie, Artie Shaw. She had sung a song about the bodies of black men hanging from southern trees at a time when singing that song required a specific kind of courage that most people who benefited from her refused to share. None of that was mentioned in the courtroom. It was not relevant to the proceeding. This is a story that does not begin in triumph and move toward tragedy. The tragedy was present from the beginning, structured into the conditions of her birth, her race, her gender, her class, and the specific country and century she was born into. What changes across the years is not the nature of the darkness, but its visibility. The machinery that shaped her life operated quietly for a long time before it became impossible to ignore. By the time she walked out of that Philadelphia courtroom in handcuffs, several different systems, legal, commercial, personal, institutional, had already been working on her for 3 decades. Some of them wore the faces of men who said they loved her. Some of them wore the faces of federal agents. Some of them wore the faces of producers and club owners and journalists who printed her name in their publications and paid her a fraction of what her name was worth. She would live for 12 more years after that courtroom. They would not be easier years. The machinery did not stop. What follows is an account of those years and the years before them, not to assign blame in a simple direction and not to construct a story of resilience that makes the audience feel better about what happened. What happened does not resolve into comfort. It sits the way certain chords sit, unfinished, asking something that no one who was in a position to answer ever chose to answer. Her voice is still being sold. The people who controlled her are mostly dead. The question of what she was owed, in money, in protection, in basic legal dignity, was never seriously asked while she was alive to hear the answer. We begin at the beginning. Eleanora Fagan was born on April 7, 1915 in Philadelphia, though Baltimore was where she was raised, and Baltimore was what marked her. She was born to Sadie Fagan, who was 19 years old, and Clarence Holiday, who was 17. Neither of them was prepared for a child. Neither of them stayed. Clarence Holiday left early and with a consistency that almost resembled a decision. He went to New York, where he eventually found work as a jazz guitarist, playing in bands that toured and recorded. He did not take his daughter with him. He did not send for her. He visited occasionally in the way that men who have left sometimes do, enough to remain a presence in a child's imagination, not enough to constitute a father. Billie Holiday would later describe him in terms that were neither bitter nor warm. She described him the way you describe a fact about the weather in a place you used to live. He was there. Then he was not. The not there was longer. Sadie Fagan moved to Baltimore and then out of Baltimore and then back, following domestic work, following men, following the narrow economic channels available to a young black woman in the American South in the early 20th century. When she was away, which was often, Eleanora was left with relatives. The record here is incomplete in the way that the records of poor black children in this period are frequently incomplete. What is known is that she spent significant stretches of her early childhood in the care of a half-sister of her mother's, a woman named Eva Miller, in a household in East Baltimore that was crowded and not unkind, but not, in any recognizable sense, stable. Baltimore in this period was a city of formal and informal segregation. The neighborhoods Eleonora grew up in were hemmed in, economically, geographically, legally. The schools available to black children were underfunded in ways that were not accidental. The streets were policed in ways that were not neutral. A child growing up in East Baltimore in the 1920s learned early what the boundaries were, not because anyone sat down and explained them, but because the boundaries made themselves known through daily contact with what was permitted and what was not. She did not attend school with any regularity. The records that exist suggest she was enrolled sporadically and was absent more than she was present. This is not a story of a child who failed to apply herself. It is a story of a child for whom the conditions of regular attendance, stability at home, adequate food, clothing that did not invite humiliation, a guardian who could enforce a routine, were not reliably present. By the time she was 10, her formal education was, for practical purposes, finished. What she had instead was the street and the church, and the music that came through both. Baltimore had a music culture that ran through its black neighborhoods with particular force. Gospel in the churches, jazz and blues in the clubs and at the rent parties that served as both social events and economic survival mechanisms for families who pooled money to make rent. Eleonora listened. She listened with the kind of attention that children who have learned not to rely on adults pay to the things that do not require anything of them in return. She has said in interviews and in the memoir she would eventually publish that she ran errands for a local brothel in exchange for the privilege of listening to Louis Armstrong and Bessie Smith records on the establishment's Victrola. The detail has the quality of legend, and it may have been shaped in the retelling, but it points to something that the documented record supports, that music was not, for her, an escape from the conditions of her life. It was continuous with those conditions. It existed in the same spaces as poverty and sex work and the informal economies of survival. She did not come to music through a conservatory or a middle-class parlor. She came to it through the back rooms of a city that was teaching her systematically what she was worth. In 1926, when Eleonora was 10 or 11, she was raped by a neighbor, a man named Wilbert Rich. What followed illuminates something about the machinery she had been born into. Rich was arrested. So was Eleonora. She was charged, under the logic of the Baltimore legal system at the time, with being a minor in circumstances of moral danger. Rich served a short sentence. Eleonora was sent to the House of the Good Shepherd for Colored Girls, a Catholic reform institution. She was held there for several months. The institution was not a place of rehabilitation in any meaningful sense. It was a place of containment. The girls held there were black girls from poor families, girls who had been failed by every structure that was supposed to protect them, now processed through a system that categorized their victimization as a form of delinquency. Eleonora was released eventually, but the experience of being institutionalized, of having the legal system respond to her assault by locking her up, was not something that faded. It was the first extended lesson in how the institutions of the society she lived in regarded her. Her mother returned to Baltimore intermittently. The household never stabilized. In 1928, when Eleonora was 13, she and her mother moved to New York City. Sadie had found work there. The apartment they moved into was in Harlem. The neighborhood was in the middle of what people were already calling a renaissance, a flowering of black cultural and intellectual life that was real and also, in specific ways, being consumed by the white downtown audiences who came uptown for entertainment without any particular interest in the conditions under which that entertainment was produced. Eleonora Fagan arrived in Harlem at 13 with no formal education, no money, no father, a mother who worked long hours and was often absent, and a past that included assault, institutionalization, and the specific knowledge that the law was not a resource available to her in the way it was available to others. She was not yet Billie Holiday. That name was still ahead of her. But the conditions that would shape what that name meant were already fully in place. The legal record from Baltimore, 1926, is sparse in the way that records involving poor black children in American cities during this period are almost always sparse. What exists is enough to establish the basic sequence of events. A neighbor named Wilbert Rich assaulted Eleonora Fagan. She was 10, possibly 11. The exact date of the assault relative to her April birthday is not precisely documented. Rich was an adult. The assault was reported. The police came. What happened next was not unusual for the time and place. It was, in fact, entirely consistent with how the legal and social systems of Baltimore processed cases involving black girls from poor households. Rich was charged and eventually served a short sentence at the city jail. Eleonora was taken into custody by the state and remanded to the House of the Good Shepherd for Colored Girls, an institution run by Catholic sisters on the west side of Baltimore. The charge against her, in the language of the period, was that she was a minor found in circumstances of moral endangerment. The language matters. It locates the problem not in the man who committed the assault, but in the conditions surrounding the child who survived it. Eleanor's circumstances, her irregular home life, her absent father, her mother's frequent departures for work, were read by the court not as evidence that she needed protection, but as evidence that she was already compromised. The institution she was sent to existed to manage girls the city had decided were problems, not victims. The House of the Good Shepherd was a place of strict routine. The girls woke early, attended Mass, worked, attended limited instruction, worked again. The nuns who ran it operated according to a model of correction that assumed the girls in their care had done something or come from something that required fixing. Eleonora was not Catholic. She was not there voluntarily. She was there because a court had decided that the appropriate response to her assault was to remove her from the street and place her somewhere she could be supervised. She has described the institution in interviews over the years with a flatness that is itself a form of testimony. She did not describe beatings or dramatic cruelties. She described boredom, rigidity, the sensation of being processed rather than seen. She described a nun who was, by her account, genuinely kind to her, a detail that sits alongside the others without softening them. Kindness from one individual within a system does not alter what the system is doing. Eleonora knew the difference. She was the kind of child who learned that distinction early, because she had to. What the stay at the House of the Good Shepherd did, in practical terms, was remove her from her already unstable home environment for several months during a formative period, and place her in an institution whose primary function was control. She received no counseling in any recognizable sense. There was no process by which the assault was addressed, examined, or acknowledged as the originating event. The institution did not concern itself with what had happened to her. It concerned itself with regulating her behavior going forward. She was released after several months and returned to her mother's care in Baltimore. Wilbert Rich had by this point served whatever short sentence the court had imposed and returned to the neighborhood. The record does not indicate that any particular arrangement was made to keep him away from her. The city had processed the case. The case was closed. Within a few years, Sadie Fagan had moved again, and Eleonora had followed. But Baltimore's lesson had already been delivered and absorbed. What the city had taught her was specific, that the systems designed to protect people like her would, when called upon, process her as the problem. This was not a lesson she could unlearn. It would shape the choices she made about who to trust, who to rely on, and how much protection she could expect from official structures for the rest of her life. There's a pattern that appears repeatedly in her later years, a pattern of returning to men who harmed her, of remaining in situations that were visibly damaging, of not calling on legal or institutional help even when it might have been available. Biographers and journalists have frequently described this pattern as self-destruction, as a psychological tendency toward damage that requires some deeper explanation rooted in her personality. What the Baltimore record suggests is something more straightforward. She had direct, early, concrete experience of what happened when she brought her harm to official attention. The official system had locked her up. The man who assaulted her had gone home. The assault and its legal aftermath also interrupted what little formal schooling she had been receiving. By the time she returned to Baltimore from the House of the Good Shepherd, whatever fragile continuity she had maintained with the school system was broken. She would not return to formal education in any sustained way. This was not again a failure of her ambition or intelligence. The record of what she accomplished as a musician, the precision of her phrasing, her harmonic instincts, the way she bent time within a bar without losing the structure of the song, is not consistent with the portrait of a person who lacked the capacity for complex, sustained learning. It is consistent with a person whose access to formal learning had been repeatedly severed by circumstances outside her control. In Harlem, which she reached with her mother in 1928, she was 13 years old. The city was large and indifferent in ways that Baltimore, for all its cruelties, had not been. She was not known here. There was no institution waiting to process her, and also no network of neighbors, no church community, no familiar geography. She and her mother moved into whatever they could afford, which was not much. Sadie found domestic work. Eleonora found the street. Harlem in 1928 was also, for a girl with no income and no adult supervision, a place with a specific economy available to young women who had nothing else to sell. She has said in her memoir that she and her mother were evicted at one point and that she turned to sex work to cover rent. She was, by her own account, around 13 or 14 at the time. The framing in the memoir is matter of fact, almost administrative. This is what the situation required. This is what she did. She was arrested in 1929 on prostitution charges and held briefly before being released. She was 14 years old. It was the second time the legal system had taken her into custody. It would not be the last. By 1930, Eleanor Fagan was 15 years old, and Harlem was in the process of contracting. The Great Depression had arrived with particular force in black neighborhoods, which had fewer economic reserves to absorb the shock and fewer institutional protections against it. The rent parties that had been a feature of Harlem social life, gatherings where guests paid admission and the proceeds covered the host's rent, became less festive and more desperate. Evictions were a regular occurrence on the block she moved through. The clubs that had drawn white downtown audiences uptown during the boom years of the late 1920s were thinning out. Money was leaving the neighborhood faster than it had arrived. Sadie Fagan was still working domestic jobs when she could find them. The apartment they shared was small, and the arrangement between mother and daughter was never quite that of parent and child in any conventional sense. Sadie was still a young woman. She had been a teenager when Eleonora was born, and the household they maintained together was more like two people pooling resources than a family organized around a child's welfare. This was not cruelty on Sadie's part. It was the arithmetic of poverty. There was not enough of anything, money, space, stability, emotional bandwidth, to organize the household around anyone's needs in particular. Eleonora had begun singing in the small clubs and speakeasies of Harlem, initially not as a featured act, but as someone who appeared, sang a few songs, and passed a hat, or accepted whatever a sympathetic owner was willing to hand over. The exact sequence of her earliest performances is difficult to reconstruct with precision. The clubs she performed in were not the kind of establishments that kept careful records or attracted newspaper coverage. They were basement operations, rooms above storefronts, places that existed in the gap between the legal and illegal economies that structured life in Harlem during Prohibition. What is documented is that she was not, in the beginning, the singer she would become. The voice was there, the quality that would eventually make producers and musicians stop whatever they were doing and pay attention. But the technique was unformed, and the repertoire was borrowed from whatever she had absorbed from records and from watching other singers' workrooms. She learned by proximity. She watched how experienced performers managed an audience, how they used silence, how they shaped a lyric. She was, in this period, a student without a school, learning a discipline through direct observation and repeated practice in front of rooms that were not always paying attention. The name came during this period. She adopted Billie, reportedly after the actress Billie Dove, whose image she admired. Holiday came from her father, Clarence Holiday, whose surname she took despite his absence. A choice that is not uncomplicated, given what his absence had meant. The new name marked something. Eleonora Fagan was the girl from Baltimore who had been processed by courts and institutions and left to manage on her own. Billie Holiday was a construction, a performed identity, built to function in a specific professional context. The construction was not false. It was made from real material, from the actual voice and the actual experience, but it was a frame placed around those things, and the frame served a purpose. In 1933, she was 18 and performing regularly enough to have come to the attention of John Hammond. Hammond was 22, the heir to a Vanderbilt fortune, educated at Yale and already positioning himself as a discoverer of black musical talent. He wrote about jazz and blues for publications in both the United States and England. He had opinions about authenticity that he expressed with the confidence of someone who had never had to consider whether his presence in a room was welcome. He heard Billie Holiday sing at a Harlem club called Monette's and wrote about her with the enthusiasm that was genuine and also proprietary in a way that he appeared not to notice. Hammond arranged a recording session for her with Benny Goodman's band in November 1933. She was 18 years old. The session produced two sides, Your Mother's Son-in-Law and Riffin' the Scotch. She was paid a flat fee. She received no royalties. This was standard industry practice for the period, particularly for black artists recording for white-owned labels, and Hammond did not appear to find it remarkable. He had found a talent. He had arranged for it to be recorded. In the accounting of the music business, as he understood it, that constituted a form of generosity. The recording circulated. Her name began to appear in the music press. She was described in the language that the white music press of the 1930s applied to black female singers, language that emphasized naturalness, instinct, and almost accidental gift, as though the precision of her phrasing were something that had simply happened to her, rather than something she had developed through years of careful listening and practice. The framing was not innocent. It positioned her talent as raw material rather than craft, which made it easier to justify the financial arrangements that surrounded it. By 1935, Hammond had arranged a more substantial series of recording sessions for her, this time with small ensembles assembled specifically for the dates. The sessions produced some of the recordings that would eventually be understood as among the most significant in the history of American popular music. The musicians on those dates, Lester Young, Teddy Wilson, Ben Webster, Roy Eldridge, were operating at a level of sophistication that demanded a great deal of the singer. She met that demand consistently. The recordings document this without ambiguity. What the recordings do not document is the financial structure surrounding them. She was paid per session. The masters belonged to the label. The musicians were paid union scale. Her name appeared on the releases, which meant her name built an audience, and that audience eventually generated revenue that flowed to the label and to the producers and to the club owners who could now book a name that people recognized. The distance between the value her name generated and the money she received for generating it was, from the beginning, substantial. She was 20 years old in 1935, performing regularly at clubs in Harlem and beginning to attract bookings downtown. The name Billie Holiday was working. It was opening doors. What she did not yet fully understand, or perhaps understood and had no mechanism to alter, was the extent to which the doors it opened led into rooms that other people controlled. In the winter of 1938, Billie Holiday was performing at Café Society in Greenwich Village. The club had opened that January, founded by Barney Josephson, and it positioned itself deliberately as an integrated venue. One of the very few in New York City where black and white performers shared a stage and black and white audiences sat in the same room without formal separation. The novelty of this arrangement was such that it required announcing. Josephson understood that his club's integration was itself a kind of performance, a statement made nightly by the fact of mixed bodies in a shared space. It was in this context that Abel Meeropol approached Holiday with a poem he had written. Meeropol was a Jewish schoolteacher from the Bronx who wrote under the pen name Lewis Allen. He had written the poem, and which he had also set to music, after seeing a photograph. The photograph, taken in 1930 in Marion, Indiana, showed the bodies of two black men, Thomas Shipp and Abner Smith, hanging from a tree in the courthouse square. A crowd of white men and women surrounded the tree. Some of them were smiling. The photograph had been reproduced and sold as a postcard. Meeropol had turned the image into a song. The lyrics described southern trees bearing strange fruit, black bodies hanging in the southern breeze. The imagery was not abstract. It was precise and cold, and asked the listener to look directly at something that American popular culture in 1939 had largely agreed not to look at directly. Josephson believed Holiday should perform it. Holiday, by several accounts, was initially uncertain. The song required something different from her technically. It moved slowly, with a deliberateness that left no room for the ornamentation she used in other material. But it also required something beyond technique. It required her to stand in front of an audience every night and deliver a lyric that described the murder of black people in language that made looking away difficult. She agreed to perform it. Josephson built a ritual around the performance. The waiters stopped serving. The room went dark except for a single spotlight on her face. She sang the song at the end of her set so that it was the last thing the audience carried out of the room. When she finished, she walked off stage without a bow. There was no encore. The lights stayed down for a moment after she left. The effect on audiences was documented by multiple people who were present during those performances. Some people wept, some sat in silence, some walked out. The discomfort was not incidental to the song's purpose, it was the purpose. She brought the song to her label, Columbia Records, and asked to record it. Columbia refused. The reasons given were commercial. The song was too controversial, too likely to alienate distributors in southern markets. John Hammond, who had been her champion at Columbia, also opposed recording it. His objection was aesthetic as well as commercial. He felt the song was not jazz, that it was more propaganda than music, and that recording it would damage her career in ways that were not worth the statement it made. The fact that he, a white man, was advising a black woman not to record a song about the lynching of black people because it might be commercially inconvenient did not appear to register with him as a position that required examination. She recorded Strange Fruit in April 1939 for Commodore Records, a small independent label run by Milt Gabler, after Columbia agreed to release her from her contract for this one session. The recording was stark. Her voice moved through the lyric without melodrama, which made it more difficult to absorb, not less. The restraint was not distance. It was control applied to something that could not be controlled if you felt it fully. The record sold. It was not a mainstream hit in the commercial sense, but it circulated widely enough to matter. It was reviewed, it was discussed, and it was noticed by people who were not music critics. Harry Anslinger had been the head of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics since 1930. He had built his career and his agency on the criminalization of drug use, and he had done so using a framework that linked narcotics explicitly to race, to black musicians, to jazz, to the social spaces where those things existed. His public statements during this period connected drug use to what he described as the degrading influence of jazz music, and his agency's enforcement practices targeted black communities and black artists with a consistency that was not random. He had been aware of Billie Holiday before Strange Fruit. After Strange Fruit, his attention became something more deliberate. Anslinger assigned an agent named Jimmy Fletcher to surveil her. Fletcher, who was black, Anslinger used black agents for operations in black communities, followed her for an extended period, attending her performances, monitoring her associations, filing reports. Fletcher would later describe, in interviews conducted decades after his retirement, the experience of surveilling her with a complexity that suggested the assignment had not been simple for him. He said he liked her. He said she treated him with warmth when he came to her shows, not knowing who he was. He continued to file reports. What Anslinger wanted was not merely to arrest her. Arrest was a tool. What he wanted, by the account of those who have studied his correspondence and internal agency documents, was to silence her. She was a black woman singing a song about lynching to integrated audiences in a city that was paying attention. The song complicated a particular narrative about American life, and Anslinger was, among other things, invested in that narrative. Her addiction to heroin had begun by this point. The timeline is not precise, but the evidence suggests the late 1930s during the period of her most intensive touring and recording. The addiction was not secret within the music industry. It was one of those facts that people who worked around her knew and discussed and largely declined to address in any way that might have helped her. The Bureau of Narcotics knew it too. It was, for Anslinger's purposes, useful. She continued to perform Strange Fruit at Café Society through 1939 and into the early 1940s. She performed it at other venues when she could. Some club owners asked her not to. Some did not book her again after she insisted on including it. The song was costing her work in specific, measurable ways, and she kept singing it. In 1935, John Hammond sat in a recording studio in New York and listened to Billie Holiday sing through a set of takes with a small ensemble he had assembled. He was 24 years old, heir to a fortune built by the Vanderbilt family on his mother's side. and he had appointed himself with the certainty available to men of his background as someone who could recognize what mattered in American music. He was not wrong about Holiday. His recognition of her talent was genuine. What it was not was disinterested. Hammond's position in the music industry of the 1930s was unusual. He did not own a label. He was not a manager in any formal sense. He was a critic, a producer in the loose sense the word carried then, a connector. Someone who moved between the black musicians he admired and the white-owned commercial structures through which their music was distributed and sold. He had access to both worlds in a way that most people did not, and he used that access to shape careers. His choices about who to champion and who to pass over carried real consequences for the people involved. His relationship with Holiday was characterized from the beginning by a specific asymmetry. He believed in her talent. He also believed, with the unexamined confidence of someone who had never been dependent on another person's approval for his economic survival, that he understood what was good for her career better than she did. When she made choices he disagreed with, about repertoire, about professional associations, about the direction she wanted to take her recording work, he expressed his disagreement as concern and his concern as authority. She was not, in his framing, an artist making decisions. She was a talent requiring management. The financial terms of the recording sessions Hammond arranged for her were not exceptional by the standards of the industry at the time, and that is precisely the point. The industry standard for black artists recording for white-owned labels in the 1930s was a flat session fee, no royalties, and no ownership of masters. Hammond did not challenge this structure on her behalf. He operated within it as a given. The recordings he produced with her, sessions that would eventually be packaged, repackaged, reissued, and sold for decades after her death, generated revenue streams in which she had no participation beyond the initial session payment. She began working with Artie Shaw's orchestra in 1938. Shaw was white, the leader of one of the most commercially successful big bands of the swing era, and hiring Holiday as his vocalist was, in the context of the time, a visible statement. Integrated bandstands were rare. Shaw made the hire knowing it was unusual and appeared to believe that the unusualness of it was itself a form of progressivism. The reality of touring with a white band as a black vocalist in 1938 was not primarily a story about progressivism. It was a story about logistics, and the logistics were governed by the racial geography of the United States. When Shaw's band traveled through the South and the border states, Holiday could not stay in the same hotels as her bandmates. She could not eat in the same restaurants. She entered venues through separate entrances. On some occasions, she was asked to wait in the tour bus while the rest of the band ate, then brought food out to her. Shaw has described these incidents in interviews over the years in terms that emphasized his own discomfort, how he had not fully anticipated the difficulty, how the situation troubled him. What his account tends not to examine in detail is what the situation meant for her, night after night, in the specific texture of daily humiliation. She was the vocalist. She sang. Then she went back to the bus. There was an incident at the Lincoln Hotel in New York where Shaw's band held a residency in which Holiday was asked by hotel management to use the service entrance and to avoid the hotel lobby when she arrived for performances. Shaw was informed of this arrangement. His response was to continue the residency. The practical calculation, the residency, was valuable. The booking was important to the band's commercial trajectory, was made, and she continued to use the service entrance. She left Shaw's orchestra in 1938 after less than a year. The departure was described at the time and has been described since in various accounts as her decision, a choice she made. That framing is accurate in the narrow sense that she was the one who left. It does not account for the conditions that made staying untenable, and it does not account for who benefited from the arrangement while it lasted and who paid the daily cost of maintaining it. She moved to the famous door on 52nd Street after leaving Shaw, performing as a featured act rather than a band vocalist. The work was steadier in some respects and more precarious in others. As a band vocalist, she had a guaranteed salary and a structured touring schedule. As a solo act, she was dependent on individual bookings, on club owners who could cancel or reduce her fee with limited recourse on the informal networks of the music business that ran on relationships she did not always control. Hammond's influence on her career began to diminish after she moved away from the Columbia orbit. His interest in her had always been partly contingent on her fitting within a particular vision of what her music should be: spare, swinging, recorded with small ensembles in a style he associated with authenticity. When she began moving toward the more orchestrated, string-laden sound she would pursue in the early 1940s, he regarded this as a decline, a commercial compromise, a departure from the qualities that had made her worth championing. His cooling was not dramatic, it was gradual. He found other artists to champion. She found other producers to work with. What she did not find was a structural arrangement that was materially different from the one Hammond had operated within. The labels she recorded for owned the masters. The producers took their fees. The club owners set the terms. She was, throughout this period, generating something of significant commercial and cultural value, and the structure surrounding that generation was designed, in every particular, to ensure that the value flowed away from her. She knew this. There are interviews from the period in which she speaks about money, about what she was paid and what she was owed, with a clarity that suggests she was not confused about her situation. Being clear-eyed about a trap is not the same as being able to exit it. In the late 1930s, Billie Holiday was performing regularly on 52nd Street, her name appearing on marquees outside clubs that filled because of her, and she was living in apartments that she furnished carefully, with an attention to domestic detail that people who knew her during this period describe with some consistency. She liked plants. She kept dogs, small ones, which she carried with her and which appeared in photographs taken during this period with a frequency that suggests they were genuinely important to her. She cooked for people. She was, by multiple accounts, generous with money when she had it, picking up tabs, lending to musicians who were short, maintaining a version of domestic life that existed in tension with the instability that surrounded it. Jimmy Monroe was a nightclub owner, a man who moved through the Harlem music world with the ease of someone who understood how to present himself. He was charming in the specific way that men who live at the intersection of entertainment and informal commerce learn to be charming. Attentive, well-dressed, fluent in the language of the scene. He and Holiday began their relationship in the late 1930s and married in 1941. She was 26 years old. Monroe introduced her to opium. This is documented in her own account and corroborated by people who were present during this period. The introduction was not coerced in any simple sense. It was offered in the context of a relationship in a domestic setting by a man she trusted. What it initiated was a deepening of the substance use that had already been a feature of her life. The heroin use that had begun in the late 1930s was now supplemented, and the pattern of use became more entrenched during the years of the marriage. Monroe was also unfaithful, habitually and without apparent concern for concealment. He ran other women through the social world they shared, in spaces where Holiday was known and present, with a casualness that several people who were around them during this period describe as deliberate, as though the public nature of the infidelity were part of its function. She knew, everyone knew she knew. The marriage continued. She has spoken about Monroe in terms that are more ambivalent than condemnatory, which is itself a form of information. He was not a man she described as simply bad. He was a man she described in the way that people describe situations they understand to be damaging and remain in any way, with a kind of tired clarity that does not resolve into a clean position. The marriage lasted, formally, until 1947, though the relationship had effectively collapsed well before then. Joe Guy came during the overlapping and immediate aftermath of Monroe. He was a trumpet player, talented enough to have worked in significant bands, and he was also addicted to heroin. This shared dependency was not incidental to the relationship. It was, in some ways, its structure. They used together. They managed the logistics of addiction together. The procurement, the money required for procurement, the practical arrangements that addiction at that level demands. Guy also managed her for a period, which meant he had access to her bookings and her fees. The financial dimension of her relationship with Guy has been examined by biographers who have found, with some consistency, that money she earned during the period he managed her did not accumulate in her account in proportion to what she was paid. The accounting is difficult to reconstruct precisely because the music business of the 1940s did not generate the kind of paper trail that makes financial reconstruction easy, particularly for black artists whose contracts were often informal and whose fees were frequently paid in cash. What is clear is that the years of her relationship with Guy were years in which her earnings did not translate into financial security, and that this was not simply a function of her spending habits, though those were not modest. Guy was with her in 1947 when the Federal Bureau of Narcotics moved. The arrest came in May of that year in a hotel room in Philadelphia. The sequence of events leading to it involved an informant and a setup that several people who have examined the case have described as engineered, a situation constructed to produce the outcome Anslinger's bureau had been working towards since at least 1939. Guy was present. Guy was not charged. He was released. She was not. Louis McKay arrived in her life in the early 1950s, after her release from Alderson, after the loss of her cabaret card, after the years of surveillance and arrest had restructured what her professional life could look like. He was a man who had been around the margins of the music world, who understood its economics, and who presented himself to her as someone who could manage the complexity of her situation. A situation that was, by the early 1950s, genuinely complex. She needed someone who could negotiate bookings for venues that did not require a cabaret card. She needed someone who could handle the financial and logistical dimensions of a career that was still generating significant audience interest despite the legal restrictions placed on it. McKay was also physically violent toward her. This is documented in police reports from the 1950s. There are records of at least one incident in which she called the police after he beat her, and accounts from people who were present in their domestic life during this period that describe a pattern of violence that was not isolated. She did not leave. She married him in 1957, at a point when her health was already declining and the years of addiction and legal persecution had taken a cumulative physical toll that was visible to people who saw her regularly. The question of why she stayed, with Monroe, with Guy, with McKay, has been answered by various writers in various ways, most of which locate the explanation inside her psychology, in the damage done in childhood, in patterns established early. These explanations are not wrong exactly, but they are incomplete in a specific way. They treat the question as though it were primarily about her interiority, as though the decision to stay were made in a vacuum rather than in a context. The context included an industry that had taken her earnings, a legal system that had taken her cabaret card, a federal agency that surveilled her movements, a professional world in which she had limited ability to operate independently. The men she stayed with were damaging. They were also, in various ways, functional, connected to the world in which she worked, capable of navigating systems that were hostile to her, present in the specific way that presence can matter when most other things have been removed. None of this made the violence acceptable. It makes the staying comprehensible in a way that the psychological explanation alone does not. The Federal Bureau of Narcotics under Harry Anslinger operated with a clarity of purpose that its public statements did not always reflect accurately. The Bureau's stated mission was the suppression of illegal drug use in the United States. Its actual operational priorities, as documented in internal correspondence, agent reports, and the pattern of its enforcement actions over 2 decades, were shaped by considerations that had as much to do with race, politics, and the management of cultural influence as they did with public health. Anslinger had been building a file on Billie Holiday since at least 1939. The file grew through the early 1940s as Jimmy Fletcher and other agents attended her performances, monitored her associations, and documented her drug use. The documentation was real. Her heroin addiction was not a fabrication of the Bureau's surveillance. But the intensity of the Bureau's interest in her was not proportionate to her significance as a drug case in any ordinary law enforcement sense. She was not a supplier. She was not a distributor. She was a user, and a user whose habit was well known within the music industry and had been for years without the Bureau moving to arrest her. What changed in the mid-1940s was not the fact of her addiction. What changed was the accumulation of reasons to move. She had continued to perform Strange Fruit. She had continued to draw integrated audiences. She had, in 1945 and 1946, been performing at venues and in contexts that kept her name in the press and her voice in the public conversation. Anslinger's correspondence from this period, portions of which have been examined by journalists and historians, reflects an irritation with her that goes beyond the bureaucratic concern with drug enforcement. She was, in his framing, a problem that needed to be addressed. The arrest in Philadelphia in May 1947 was the culmination of a setup that involved an informant working with the Bureau. The informant's name was John Levy, not the John Levy who would later become her manager, but a man who had been placed in her orbit and who provided the Bureau with the access it needed to move. Joe Guy, her companion at the time, was present in the hotel room when the agents arrived. The distinction in how the two of them were treated by the Bureau in the hours and days that followed was stark, and given the Bureau's documented interest in Holiday specifically, not accidental. Guy was released. She was charged. Her attorney at the time advised her to plead guilty. The advice was not unreasonable given the legal landscape. Contesting the charge would have required resources she did not have and would have prolonged a process whose outcome, given the political weight behind the prosecution, was unlikely to be favorable. She pleaded guilty in federal court in Philadelphia. She was sentenced to a year and a day at the Federal Reformatory for Women at Alderson, West Virginia, and fined $1. The sentencing was covered by the press. The coverage was not uniformly hostile. Some journalists noted the disparity between the sentence and the circumstances, the absence of Guy from the charges, the question of entrapment. But the dominant frame in the mainstream press was one that had been available for years in American journalism when writing about black women and addiction. The story of a fallen talent, a wasted gift, a woman who had brought her troubles on herself. She arrived at Alderson in May 1947. The reformatory was a federal institution that held women convicted of federal crimes, and it operated on a model of rehabilitation through labor and routine that had been the basis of American prison reform since the 19th century. The women incarcerated there worked, in the laundry, in the kitchen, in the grounds maintenance that kept the institution's campus presentable. The work was not optional. The routine was enforced with the consistency available to institutions that control every dimension of daily life. She served her time without the public incidents that would have generated press coverage. People who were incarcerated at Alderson during the same period have described her, in accounts collected by biographers, as someone who kept to herself, who was liked by the other women, who did not perform her celebrity in the way that might have been expected. She worked. She waited. She did not use drugs while incarcerated, which meant she was, for the first time in years, physically free of the heroin dependence that had structured so much of her daily existence. This was not a therapeutic process. It was enforced abstinence, with no treatment, no counseling, no addressing of the underlying conditions. When she left, she would be physically withdrawn, but not, in any meaningful clinical sense, treated. She was released in March 1948, having served approximately 10 months. The release was covered by the press with the same mixture of prurience and condescension that had characterized the coverage of her arrest. She gave an interview or two. She spoke carefully. She was 32 years old and she had a concert booked. The concert was at Carnegie Hall on March 27, 1948, 2 weeks after her release from Alderson. It sold out. The audience that came to Carnegie Hall that night came with the full knowledge of where she had been and what she had been through, and the ticket sales suggest that this knowledge was not a deterrent. If anything, the narrative of her imprisonment had made her more visible, her return to the stage more charged. She performed for 2 hours. The reviews were strong. What the Carnegie Hall concert did not undo was the administrative consequence that had been set in motion by her conviction. Under New York City law, a criminal conviction disqualified an individual from holding a cabaret card, the license required to perform in any venue that served alcohol. The New York Police Department administered the cards, and the department's position on her application was not ambiguous. She was denied. The denial was not a dramatic announcement. It was a bureaucratic determination, processed through the licensing division of the police department, recorded in paperwork. It produced no headlines comparable to the arrest. It was quieter than any of the events that had preceded it, and it would prove more damaging than any of them. She could not perform in New York clubs. The clubs were where she worked. The clubs were where jazz lived, where audiences found performers, where the informal economy of the music business operated nightly. Carnegie Hall could book her for a special event. The clubs that filled 5 nights a week, that paid weekly salaries, that sustained careers across years, those were closed to her by a card she could not obtain. She was 32 years old, recently released from federal prison, and the city where she had built her career had just quietly removed the foundation it rested on. The Federal Reformatory for Women at Alderson, West Virginia, sat in a valley in the Greenbrier River region, surrounded by hills that were green in summer and gray in winter. It had been established in 1927 as a model institution. The first federal prison for women in the United States, designed by reformers who believed that incarcerated women deserved a different environment than the cell blocks that held men. The campus was arranged to resemble a small college, with cottages instead of cells, shared living spaces instead of tiers, grounds that were maintained with a deliberateness that was meant to communicate something about the institution's philosophy. The philosophy was rehabilitation through domesticity. The women at Alderson cooked, cleaned, sewed, gardened, and laundered. The labor was organized around the skills deemed appropriate for women of the period, skills that would, in the reformers' conception, allow them to reintegrate into society as functional domestic workers or wives. The model assumed a particular kind of woman and a particular kind of future. It did not account well for a woman who had spent a decade as one of the most recognizable performers in American music. Billie Holiday arrived at Alderson in May 1947. She was processed, assigned a number, issued clothing, and placed in a cottage with other women. The details of her daily life there are reconstructed primarily from accounts she gave in interviews after her release and from the recollections of women who were incarcerated alongside her, collected by researchers and biographers in subsequent decades. The picture that emerges is not one of dramatic suffering. It is one of sustained, low-level grinding. The particular texture of institutional life, which operates through routine and deprivation of choice, rather than through acute cruelty. She worked in the kitchen for a period. She worked in the laundry. She did not, during her time at Alderson, perform music in any organized sense. There were no instruments available to her, no rehearsal spaces, no context in which her specific skills had any function. For a woman whose professional identity had been built entirely around performance, whose sense of herself was inseparable from the act of standing in front of an audience and singing, the absence of that context for 10 months was its own particular form of loss. The enforced withdrawal from heroin that her incarceration produced was physically brutal in the initial weeks. Withdrawal from opiates without medical management, and ratio 9, and the management available at Alderson was minimal, involves a period of acute physical distress that is not metaphorical. It is a specific, prolonged physical experience involving pain, sleeplessness, nausea, and a range of symptoms that make ordinary functioning difficult. She went through this in a cottage dormitory in West Virginia, among women she did not know, without the support structures that might have made the process less damaging. After the acute phase passed, she was physically stable. This stability was real, but also misleading, in the way that enforced abstinence is often misleading. The conditions that had contributed to her drug use, the stress of constant performance, the financial insecurity, the relationships that had normalized and facilitated her habit, the surveillance and legal pressure that had structured her daily life. None of those had changed. They were waiting for her outside the reformatory's gates. The institution had removed the substance. It had not addressed anything that had led to the substance. What Alderson did take, in ways that were concrete and lasting, extended beyond the 10 months of her sentence. The physical toll of the withdrawal and the months of institutional living was visible to people who saw her before and after. Photographs from the period immediately following her release show a woman who looks different from the photographs taken in the early 1940s. Not simply older, but diminished in a specific way, as though something had been compressed. Musicians who worked with her in the late 1940s have noted, in various accounts, that her voice after Alderson was changed, not destroyed, but altered, the upper register less reliable, the breath support less consistent than it had been. There was also the matter of what had happened to her professional world while she was incarcerated. 10 months is not a long time in a human life, but in the music business of the 1940s, it was long enough for the landscape to shift. Other singers had moved into the spaces she had occupied. Club owners had rearranged their bookings. the informal relationships that sustained a performance career. The managers, the agents, the club owners who called when a date opened up had not been maintained during her absence because they could not be maintained from Alderson. Joe Guy was not waiting for her in any meaningful sense. The relationship had effectively dissolved. The people who had been around her before the arrest were in various states of distance. Louis McKay, who would eventually become her husband, was present in her life in this period. But the nature of his presence, the extent to which it was supportive versus extractive, was not clear yet, or was clear to some people who were watching and not to her. She was released in March 1948 and returned to New York. The Carnegie Hall concert that followed 2 weeks later was a genuine event. The hall was full, the performance was strong, and the coverage it generated confirmed that her audience had not disappeared. But the concert was a single night. What followed it was the daily reality of a career that had been structurally altered by the cabaret card denial in ways that no single performance could undo. The card itself, a small document issued by the New York Police Department that permitted an individual to work in licensed premises, had been the unremarked foundation of everything. Jazz existed in clubs. The clubs served liquor. The liquor required licensing. The licensing was administered by the police. The police had the authority to deny cards to individuals with criminal convictions, and they exercised that authority in her case without appeal or exception. She applied for reinstatement of the card multiple times in the years following her release. The applications were denied. The police department's position did not change. There is no documented evidence that anyone in a position of institutional authority, at the label, at the booking agencies, in the music industry's professional organizations, made a serious effort to advocate on her behalf for the card's reinstatement. The industry that had profited from her for 15 years watched the bureaucratic door close and did not push against it. What she was left with was a career that could exist only in the spaces that did not require the card. Concert halls, theaters, out-of-state venues, foreign tours, these spaces were real, they were not nothing. But they were a fraction of what the clubs had been, and they operated on a different economic logic, one that required larger promotional investments, less frequent bookings, and a different kind of sustained organizational support than she had reliable access to. The New York City cabaret card system had existed in various forms since the 1920s, administered by the police department's licensing division as a mechanism for regulating the people who worked in establishments that served alcohol. By the late 1940s, it had become in practice a tool with a specific application. It could be used to remove people from the club circuit without the procedural requirements of a criminal prosecution. A conviction was sufficient grounds for denial. An arrest, even without conviction, could trigger a review. The system did not require the police department to explain its decisions in detail or to provide meaningful avenues for appeal. It operated administratively, which meant it operated quietly, and the quietness was part of its utility. Billie Holiday had been denied her card following her 1947 conviction. She had applied for reinstatement and been refused. By 1948 and into 1949, she was navigating a professional landscape that had been fundamentally altered by this single administrative determination. The clubs on 52nd Street, which had been the center of her working life for nearly a decade, were closed to her. The Harlem venues that had been her earliest professional home were closed to her. The network of smaller clubs across the 5 boroughs that constituted the lower tier of the jazz economy, the places where a performer could work steadily, build a local audience, maintain the continuous practice that keeps a voice and a performer sharp, all of it closed. What remained was the concert hall circuit, and the concert hall circuit had its own logic. Carnegie Hall could book her, and did, for events that drew on her name and her story, as much as on the music itself. The Town Hall in Manhattan booked her. Promoters in cities outside New York arranged performances at theaters and auditoriums that did not fall under the cabaret card jurisdiction. These were real opportunities, and she took them, but they were episodic rather than continuous. A concert hall booking was an event, something that required advance promotion and ticket sales, and a particular kind of audience mobilization. A club booking was a week of nightly performances, a sustained engagement that paid weekly and kept a performer connected to the daily life of the music. The financial difference between the two models was significant. A week at a club like the famous Door or Kelly's Stables, even at the lower end of what she could command, produced a reliable income stream. A concert hall appearance required selling enough tickets to cover the hall rental, the promotional costs, the musicians' fees, and whatever percentage went to the promoter before she saw anything. The gross number on a concert hall ticket might look larger than a club weekly, but the net, after the structure of the concert business extracted its share, was often less stable. She was also during this period navigating the ongoing reality of her addiction. The enforced abstinence of Alderson had not persisted. She had returned to heroin use within a relatively short period of her release, which was not an unusual outcome for someone released from incarceration, with no treatment, no support structure, and an immediate return to the same environment and relationships that had surrounded her use before. The people around her who supplied and enabled her habit were still there. The stress that had accompanied her use, financial instability, professional uncertainty, the surveillance that had never fully lifted, had intensified rather than diminished. Louis McKay was consolidating his presence in her life during this period. He had positioned himself as a manager and protector, someone who could navigate the practical difficulties of operating a career without a cabaret card, who understood the informal networks through which bookings could still be arranged, who could handle the logistics that her addiction and her legal status made complicated. His usefulness was real. So was his control. The financial arrangements of his management of her career have been examined by several biographers with access to whatever records survived, and the picture they produce is consistent. Money that should have reached her did not always reach her, or did not reach her in full, or reached her in ways that kept her dependent on McKay for access to her own earnings. This was not an unusual arrangement in the music business of the period, particularly for black artists managed by men who understood that their clients had limited ability to seek legal redress. The informal nature of many of the agreements meant there was little paper to challenge. She earned. The money moved. Where it settled was not always where it should have been. In 1949, she was arrested again, this time in San Francisco, on charges of possession of opium. The charge came during a period when the Bureau's surveillance of her had not abated despite her release from Alderson. She was acquitted, the jury found in her favor after a trial. But the arrest itself generated press coverage, another round of the fallen talent narrative, another documented incident in the file that the Bureau maintained on her. The acquittal was reported, but it was reported the way acquittals are reported when the defendant is already understood, in the press's construction, to be guilty of something, as a legal outcome, not as a vindication. The San Francisco acquittal did not restore her cabaret card. A conviction was required for denial, and there had been no new conviction, but the card denial from 1947 remained in effect, and the police department showed no inclination to revisit it. She was acquitted in California and still could not work in New York clubs. She continued to perform wherever she could. She recorded. The recordings from the early 1950s, made for Verve Records under the production of Norman Granz, are among the most technically accomplished of her career. The voice changed from what it had been in the mid-1930s, deeper and with less of the effortless upper register, but the interpretive intelligence more concentrated, the control over time and phrasing more deliberate. She was not declining as an artist in these years. She was developing in directions that required attention to hear properly. What was declining was the infrastructure around her. The steady income from club work was gone. The management of her finances was in the hands of a man who had reasons to keep her dependent. The legal harassment had not ended. The Bureau continued to maintain its interest in her, continued to receive reports, continued to treat her as an ongoing case rather than a closed one. And her health, which the years of addiction and the physical toll of the Alderson withdrawal had already compromised, was beginning to show the signs of longer-term damage. She was 35 years old in 1950. The decade ahead would not loosen what had tightened around her. In January 1954, Billie Holiday boarded a plane for Europe. It was her first trip abroad, and the logistics of arranging it had required navigating the specific complications of her legal status. A passport application for someone with a federal conviction required documentation and review that a straightforward application did not, and there had been uncertainty about whether it would be approved. It was. She arrived in London carrying the accumulated weight of everything the previous decade had produced. The Alderson sentence, the cabaret card denial, the arrests, the management arrangements that had drained her finances, the addiction that had not been treated and had not stopped. What she found in Europe was an audience that had been listening to her recordings for years and had constructed, from those recordings, an image of her that was not mediated by the American press's version of her story. The European jazz audience of the early 1950s knew her through the Columbia recordings, through Strange Fruit, through the Verve sessions. They knew her as a musician, the narrative of the fallen talent, the addict, the woman who had brought her troubles on herself. That narrative had not saturated the European music press the way it had saturated the American press, or had saturated it differently, with a different weighting. The British leg of the tour was complicated almost immediately. The Musicians' Union in Britain had a reciprocity agreement with the American Federation of Musicians that restricted American musicians from performing commercially in the United Kingdom, a protectionist arrangement that had been in place since the 1930s and that applied to her as it applied to everyone. She was permitted to appear on television, which was not covered by the union agreement in the same way. She appeared on a BBC broadcast that reached an audience she had no other way to access. The response was significant enough to generate press coverage that circulated beyond Britain. The continental dates were less encumbered. In Scandinavia, in Germany, and France, she performed for audiences that received her with a quality of attention that she described in interviews as different from what she experienced in American venues. The difference she was pointing to was real, though it was not simple. European audiences in the early 1950s brought their own set of projections to Black American musicians, a romanticization that was not entirely different from exoticization, an enthusiasm that sometimes owed more to what jazz represented culturally in post-war Europe than to a precise understanding of the music itself. The attention was genuine. It was also, in specific ways, its own form of construction. But she was performing in rooms where people sat and listened. She was being reviewed by critics who wrote about her phrasing and her interpretation and her relationship to the material. She was being treated, in the specific context of those performances, as an artist whose work warranted serious engagement. This was not the universal experience she had in the United States, where the press coverage of her performances was frequently inseparable from the coverage of her legal history and her addiction. She returned to the United States after the European tour, and the contrast was immediate and administrative. There are accounts from people who were with her at the airport upon her return describing federal agents who were present to observe her arrival, who noted her return in the Bureau's ongoing file, who treated her re-entry into the country as an event requiring documentation. She had been abroad for weeks, performing for audiences who had received her as a significant artist. She stepped off the plane and was watched. The cabaret card remained denied. The New York clubs remained closed. Whatever momentum the European tour had generated in terms of renewed critical attention existed in a professional context that the card denial continued to constrain. She could not translate the attention into the kind of sustained club work that would have made the attention economically meaningful in her daily life. She returned to Europe in 1958, this time for a more extensive series of engagements that included a television appearance in Britain and concert dates across the continent. The 1958 trip was documented more thoroughly than the 1954 tour. There are filmed recordings of performances from this period that allow a direct assessment of where she was as a performer 14 years after the peak years of the Columbia recordings. The voice was heavier. The tempo of her interpretations had slowed further. The space she left in a phrase, the way she allowed a lyric to breathe before resolving it, had become more pronounced. The filmed performances from 1958 are watched differently now than they were received at the time because the people watching them now know they are watching someone in the final year of her life. The shadow of what is coming falls across the images in retrospect, but the performances themselves are not the performances of a diminished artist. They are the performances of an artist who has found, through necessity or through development or through some combination of both, a way of working with what she has rather than reaching for what she no longer has. This is a different thing from decline. The 1958 European tour also generated a specific document that has been examined by people interested in her final years. A recording made in Cologne in February of that year, released under the title Lady in Satin. The album was recorded with a full-string orchestra, arranged by Ray Ellis in a style that Hammond and others in the critical establishment had always regarded as the wrong direction for her. Too lush, too arranged, too far from the spare small group settings they associated with her best work. The album was not well received by the jazz press upon its release. She had wanted to make it for years. The material was songs she had been carrying for a long time. Standards, ballads, songs about love and its failures that she sang in a voice that had been altered by everything that had altered her. Norman Granz, who had produced her Verve recordings, was not involved. She worked with Ellis and pushed through the sessions, despite a physical condition that made sustaining the demands of the material genuinely difficult. When the album was finished, she listened to the playback and wept. The people present interpreted this differently. Some thought she was moved by the music, some thought she was distressed by what she heard in her own voice. She did not explain. She had made what she wanted to make, and whatever she heard in the playback, it was something the critics who dismissed the album were not positioned to hear from where they were sitting. In 1956, Doubleday published a book with Billie Holiday's name on the cover. The title was Lady Sings the Blues. The author credit read Billie Holiday with William Dufty. Dufty was a journalist, a staff writer at the New York Post, whose wife Maylie had been a friend of Holiday's and whose involvement in the project had begun as an act of friendship and had become something more complicated in the execution. The book had been conceived and sold to a publisher on the premise of Holiday's story, in her own words. The advance was not large. The arrangement was straightforward in the way that celebrity memoir arrangements of the period were straightforward. A famous person's name and story, shaped into a readable narrative by a writer with the skills to produce a manuscript on a deadline, published under the famous person's name. What the reader received as Holiday's voice was a collaborative construction and the nature of that collaboration. What Dufty shaped, what he emphasized, what he omitted, what he added, determined what the book was. Dufty conducted extensive interviews with Holiday over a concentrated period in 1955 and early 1956. He has described the process in subsequent interviews as one in which she talked and he wrote that he was transcribing and organizing rather than inventing. The distinction is real but also partial. The act of organizing, of deciding what goes first, what gets a chapter, what gets a sentence, what gets left out of the manuscript entirely, is not a neutral act. It shapes what a story means as surely as the choice of what to include. What the book included was a version of her life that was candid about her addiction, candid about her childhood, candid about the assaults and the institutions and the legal system's treatment of her. It named names in some cases and avoided them in others. It described the rape in Baltimore. It described the brothels in Harlem. It described the arrests and the prison sentence. In the context of 1956, these were disclosures that carried real risk. The book was not a protected literary exercise. It was a commercial publication subject to the same legal and social pressures as anything else with her name on it. But the book also had a shape, and the shape was not entirely hers. The narrative arc that Dufty constructed moved through her life in a way that emphasized certain kinds of dramatic incident and muted others. The financial exploitation, the structural arrangements by which the music industry had extracted value from her work for 2 decades, appears in the book in ways that are less precise and less angry than her documented statements on the subject in interviews from the same period suggest she actually felt about it. The men who had managed and harmed her appear, but the economic dimensions of their harm, the specific mechanisms by which they had taken her money, are less developed than the emotional and physical dimensions. Louis Mackay was involved in the book's production in ways that are not fully documented, but that several people who were present during the period have described as influential. Mackay was her manager and would become her husband the following year. He had an interest in how she was portrayed, and specifically in how the men in her life were portrayed relative to himself. People who knew both of them during this period have said in various accounts that Mackay's presence around the manuscript was not passive. Whether his influence extended to specific editorial decisions is not provable from the available record. What is provable is that the book's treatment of his predecessors is harder than its treatment of him, and that this asymmetry benefited him. The chapter on strange fruit is present in the book, but compressed. The Federal Bureau of Narcotics and Harry Anslinger appear, but the extent of the Bureau's organized campaign against her, the years of surveillance, the engineered arrest, the deliberate targeting that has been documented in subsequent research, is not fully developed. Some of this is a function of what was knowable in 1956. The internal Bureau documents that would later substantiate the scale of Anslinger's operation were not publicly available when the book was written, but some of it is also a function of the legal environment in which the book was published. Anslinger was still the head of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics in 1956. He would remain in that position until 1962. A book that named him directly as the architect of a campaign to silence a black musician by weaponizing the drug laws was a book that invited legal consequences its publisher was not prepared to absorb. The book was reviewed widely. The reviews were generally positive in the way that reviews of celebrity memoirs tend to be positive, appreciative of the candor, moved by the drama, interested in the story. Some reviewers noted the roughness of the prose, which they attributed to the rawness of her voice coming through the writing. The roughness was in fact a function of the collaboration, of Dufty's attempt to render her speech patterns in text, which produced something that read as vernacular authenticity to readers who did not know how the book had been made. She promoted the book, she gave interviews, she appeared at events. In the photographs from the promotion period, she looks tired in a way that the photographs from the late 1940s do not quite capture. Not the compressed look of the post-Alderson photographs, but a different kind of tiredness, the kind that accumulates across years of managing a public version of yourself that is built from the real material of your life but does not belong to you in the way that a private self belongs to itself. The book sold well enough to generate multiple printings. It was translated into several languages. It entered the story of her life as a primary document, shaping how subsequent writers, journalists, and audiences understood her, not because it was false, but because it was partial, and the partiality was not random. The gaps in the book's account were not accidental omissions. They were places where the full account would have been inconvenient for someone, for the publisher, for the Bureau, for McKay, for the industry that had taken from her and was still, at the time of publication, in the process of taking. She had been given the opportunity to tell her story. The opportunity came with conditions. The conditions shaped the story. What remained? Between the lines of what Dufty organized into chapters was a fuller account that she carried, but that the book, for all its candor, did not fully contain. By 1957, Billie Holiday was 41 years old, and the accumulation of everything the previous 2 decades had produced was visible in ways that could not be managed by presentation or distance. Her liver was damaged, the consequence of years of alcohol use alongside the heroin, a combination whose physical toll is not subtle and does not reverse. Her weight had fluctuated dramatically across the 1950s, dropping in ways that alarmed people who saw her regularly and then stabilizing and then dropping again. Her hands showed the evidence of years of intravenous drug use. People who worked with her in this period describe a woman who could still, when she walked onto a stage, locate something that transformed the room. But who was, in the hours before and after that transformation, moving through daily life with a physical difficulty that was becoming harder to conceal. Louis McKay had married her in March 1957 in a small ceremony in Mexicali, Mexico. The marriage had a practical dimension that was not separate from its emotional one, as her husband McKay had a legal standing in relation to her affairs, her contracts, her finances, her medical decisions, that a boyfriend or common law partner did not have. He was already functioning as her manager. The marriage formalized a set of arrangements that had been operating informally for several years, and the formalization served his interests in ways that would become fully visible only after her death. The Carnegie Hall concert in November 1956, recorded and eventually released as an album, had demonstrated to anyone who needed demonstrating that audiences would still come to hear her. The hall was full. The performance was uneven in the way that her live performances had become uneven, capable of moments of concentrated intensity that no other singer of the period could produce, interspersed with passages where the voice showed its damage plainly. The unevenness itself had become part of the experience for audiences who had been following her for years. They heard both things, what remained and what had been taken. The Verve recordings she made through the mid-1950s under Norman Grantz's production were being received well critically. Grantz understood what he had, not simply a vocalist in decline, but an interpretive intelligence that was, in specific respects, still developing. And he gave her material and settings that allowed that intelligence to operate. The financial terms of the Verve arrangement were better than what she had received at Columbia in the 1930s, which is not a high bar. The masters remained with Verve. The royalties, whatever they were, moved through management. McKay's management of her finances in the late 1950s has been described by biographers with access to whatever records survived as a continuation of the pattern that had characterized her financial life for decades. Earnings that did not accumulate, fees that passed through arrangements she did not fully control, a persistent gap between what she was paid and what she had. She was performing at concert halls and at venues outside New York that the cabaret card restriction did not reach, and she was earning real money at these performances. The money did not stay with her. She spoke about this in interviews from the period with a candor that the interviewers sometimes treated as evidence of confusion or paranoia, as a symptom of her condition rather than as an accurate description of her circumstances. She said in an interview from 1958 that she had been working for 30 years and had nothing to show for it. She named the people she believed had taken from her. The interview was published, but the specific claims were treated carefully by the journalist, softened in context, framed as the complaints of a troubled woman rather than as the documented grievances of someone who had been systematically exploited. The exploitation was real. The framing was more comfortable for everyone except her. The last full year of sustained performance was 1958. She worked through it despite the physical difficulty because working was what she had always done, and because not working meant not earning. And not earning meant being entirely dependent on McKay for access to money, which was a dependence she understood and resisted even as she was unable to break it. She performed in Europe in the spring and summer. She performed on the East Coast in the fall. The performances were not uniform. Some of them were, by the accounts of people who were present, remarkable. Some of them were difficult to watch. Both things were true across the same tour. In December 1958, she performed at a benefit concert in New York. She was photographed that evening in the lobby of the venue by a photographer who had been following her career for years. The photographs from that evening have been published in several collections. In them, she's wearing a fur stole and her hair is up, and she's standing in a crowd of people, most of whom are looking at her. She is looking at something outside the frame of the photograph, or at nothing in particular. The expression on her face is not readable as any single emotion. It is the expression of someone who has been in rooms like this one for a very long time. Her health deteriorated sharply in the early months of 1959. The liver disease that had been developing for years was advancing. She was losing weight again. She was having difficulty eating. Friends and musicians who saw her in the spring of 1959 describe a woman who was plainly ill in ways that went beyond what her drug use alone could account for. A systemic decline that required medical attention she was not consistently receiving, partly because the medical attention available to her was constrained by her financial situation, and partly because the people around her were not always making decisions oriented toward her welfare. She continued to make plans. She spoke about recordings she wanted to make. She spoke about performances she intended to give. The plans were genuine in the sense that she articulated them with specificity, not the vague talk of someone drifting, but the concrete plans of someone who expected to keep working. The body was doing something different from what she was planning, and the people who should have been ensuring she received the care that might have extended her life were occupied with other calculations. In May 1959, she collapsed at her apartment on West 87th Street. The person who called for help was a friend, not McKay, who was not present. She was taken to Knickerbocker Hospital, then transferred to Metropolitan Hospital on 97th Street. She was admitted with liver disease complicated by cardiac failure. She was 43 years old. Metropolitan Hospital occupied a city block on the Upper East Side of Manhattan, a public institution that served the population of East Harlem and the surrounding neighborhoods. A population that was predominantly poor, predominantly black and Puerto Rican, and that had access to Metropolitan because it was the institution available to them, rather than because it was the institution they would have chosen. The building was functional in the way that underfunded public hospitals are functional. The staff worked, the wards were full, the resources were insufficient for the demand placed on them. It was the kind of place that processed large numbers of people efficiently and treated none of them with the particular attention that their individual conditions might have warranted. Billie Holiday was admitted to Metropolitan in late May 1959. The admitting diagnosis was liver disease and cardiac failure, which was accurate as far as it went. She was placed in a ward, given a bed, and began receiving the treatment that the hospital's resources allowed. The treatment was not aggressive in the way that the same condition treated at a well-funded private hospital might have been aggressive. It was management. Management of symptoms, management of decline, rather than the kind of intensive intervention that might have altered the trajectory. Word spread quickly that she was hospitalized. The music world knew within days. Some people came. Lester Young, the tenor saxophonist who had been her closest musical collaborator in the 1930s and who had given her the nickname Lady Day, did not come. He had died in March 1959, 2 months before her admission, his own health destroyed by years of alcohol use and the accumulated damage of a life that had not been kind to him either. The two of them had drifted apart in the years before his death, estranged by circumstances and by the specific difficulty of maintaining closeness when both people are in decline. He was gone before she was hospitalized. She had learned of his death while she was still performing, still making plans. Friends came to the hospital room, musicians came, journalists came, some of whom were there to report and some of whom came because she had mattered to them in the way that artists matter to people who have been listening to them for years. The room was not empty. There were flowers. There were people. Louis McKay was present intermittently. The accounts of his presence during her hospitalization vary. Some people who were there describe him as attentive during certain visits. Others describe long absences, a pattern of appearing and disappearing that tracked in their accounts with whether there was something requiring his attention rather than simply her. He was managing affairs that extended beyond her hospital room. What those affairs consisted of and how much of his attention they required is not fully documented. On July 22, 1959, while she was in her hospital bed at Metropolitan, federal agents arrived. They were from the Bureau of Narcotics. Someone. The record is not clear on who, and the clarity may never be recoverable, had provided information to the Bureau that she was in possession of narcotics. The agents entered her room, searched it, and found a small quantity of heroin. She was arrested. She was fingerprinted. She was charged with narcotics possession while lying in a hospital bed in which she was being treated for the condition that would kill her. The arrest was covered by the press. The coverage was not uniformly outraged. The Bureau's action was presented in some outlets as a straightforward enforcement matter. A woman with a long history of drug involvement found in possession, the law operating as the law operated. Other coverage noted the circumstances with something closer to what the circumstances warranted, that arresting a dying woman in her hospital bed for possession of a quantity of heroin too small to constitute a supply case was not a law enforcement action with a proportionate justification. That Anslinger's Bureau had been pursuing her for 20 years and had, in its final action against her, waited until she was hospitalized and dying to make its move. Anslinger was no longer the head of the Bureau in July 1959. He had been moved to a different position within the Treasury Department earlier that year. But the Bureau he had built and the priorities he had established did not retire with his direct leadership. The agents who came to her room were acting within an institutional culture and an ongoing case file that Anslinger had created. The arrest was the Bureau's final entry in a file that had been opened 20 years earlier by a man who had decided that a black woman singing a song about lynching required suppression. The legal proceedings that followed her arrest were not resolved before her death. A judge ruled that she could remain in the hospital for treatment while the case was pending. The case was pending when she died. It was never prosecuted to conclusion because there was no one left to prosecute. After the arrest, the hospital restricted her visitors. The legal situation created an administrative context in which the hospital's obligations shifted. She was now technically a person under legal supervision, and the management of her room and her visitors was affected by this status. Friends who came to see her in the weeks following the arrest found the access more complicated than it had been before. Some were turned away. Some were permitted to visit for limited periods. She gave no interviews after the arrest. She spoke to people who came. There are accounts from visitors of conversations, of her being alert and communicative on some days and less so on others, of her talking about music, about people she missed, about things she wanted to do. She asked about the status of her finances. She was told various things by various people. Whether what she was told was accurate is not entirely clear from the accounts that survive. The money in her bank account at the time of her admission to Metropolitan was, by the accounts of those who have examined the financial records, minimal. The exact figure that has been cited most consistently across biographies is 70 cents, the literal balance of her account. There was also reportedly a sum of cash taped to her leg when she was admitted, several $100s, held there in the way that someone holds cash when they have learned not to trust the systems available to keep it safe. She had earned, by the most conservative estimates of music historians who have attempted to calculate what her recordings and performances generated across her career, a sum that bears no relationship to 70 cents. The distance between those two numbers is not a mystery. It is a ledger. Someone has the rest of it distributed across decades of arrangements that the people who benefited from them did not find remarkable. The financial record of Billie Holiday's career is not difficult to trace and outline, though the specifics resist precise reconstruction because the music business of the 1930s through the 1950s was not organized around transparency, and many of the arrangements that governed her earnings were informal, oral, or documented in contracts whose terms were structured to benefit everyone except the person performing. What the outline shows is consistent and unambiguous. She generated significant commercial value across 3 decades, and she died with 70 cents in her bank account. The Columbia recordings she made between 1933 and 1942, the sessions with Teddy Wilson, with Lester Young, with the small ensembles that Hammond assembled, and that produced what are now understood as some of the defining recordings of the swing era, were made under flat fee arrangements. She was paid per session. The fees were modest by the standards of what the recordings eventually generated. The masters belonged to Columbia. The royalty streams that those recordings produced across subsequent decades, through initial sales, through repackaging and reissue, through the licensing of her voice to films, commercials, and compilations, flowed to Columbia and to the people who held the rights, not to her. This was not exceptional. It was the standard arrangement for black artists recording for major labels in the 1930s and 1940s, and in many cases, well beyond. The structure of the recording industry during this period was built on the systematic separation of black artists from ownership of their recorded work, and it operated with a consistency that suggests design rather than accident. Hammond understood this structure and worked within it. The label executives who signed the contracts understood it. The lawyers who drew up the agreements understood it. She understood it too, with the clarity she had about her situation throughout her career. But understanding a trap is not the same as having the means to exit it. The Decca recordings she made in the mid-1940s, the period that produced Lover Man and Good Morning Heartache, and a body of work that brought her to a mainstream pop audience wider than the jazz club circuit, were made under arrangements that were somewhat better in their formal structure, but that produced similar practical outcomes. Decca paid royalties nominally. The calculation of those royalties, the accounting of sales, the deduction of recording costs and promotional expenses from earnings before royalties were calculated, these were processes that the label controlled and that artists without independent legal representation and accounting oversight had limited ability to verify or challenge. She did not have independent legal representation of the kind that would have been necessary to audit the accounting. By the time she signed with Verve Records in the early 1950s, Norman Granz had built a label with a reputation for treating its artists better than the major labels had. The Verve arrangements were not as exploitative as the Columbia arrangements had been. The masters still belonged to the label. Granz would eventually sell Verve, and when he did, the catalog he sold included her recordings, and the money from that sale did not reach her. Louis Mackay held power of attorney over her affairs at various points during their relationship and marriage. The documents that established this arrangement gave him legal authority to act on her behalf in financial and contractual matters. He used this authority in ways that, from the available record, consistently produced outcomes that were better for him than for her. He negotiated bookings and took a management percentage. He handled cash from performances and arrangements that did not consistently produce paper trails. He was present at financial transactions that she was not present at, representing her interests in ways that the subsequent state of her finances suggests were not conducted with her welfare as the primary consideration. After her death, McKay moved quickly. He had positioned himself through the marriage and through the legal arrangements that the marriage had enabled or formalized to claim rights over her estate and over her name. The estate itself, at the time of her death, was nearly valueless in financial terms. 70 cents in a bank account, some personal possessions, clothing, the dog she had always kept. But her name was not valueless. Her recordings were not valueless. The commercial potential of her image, her story, and her voice in the years after her death was something that McKay and the people who subsequently acquired interests from him understood clearly. The rights to Lady Sings the Blues passed through a series of arrangements following her death. The book had been written under her name with Dufty. The publishing rights were held by arrangements that did not consistently center her estate's interests. When the 1972 film of the same name was produced, starring Diana Ross, directed by Sidney Furie, bearing only the most schematic relationship to the documented facts of her life. The people who profited from her name and story were not people who had protected her or supported her when she was alive to need protection and support. The film was a commercial success. It was nominated for 5 Academy Awards. Diana Ross received an Academy Award nomination for her performance. The production had licensed the title and some rights from arrangements that trace back to McKay and to the web of claims that had been built around her story after her death. The film invented freely composite characters, scenes with no historical basis, a narrative arc that moved toward a kind of redemptive suffering that the actual record of her life does not support. It was her name on the poster and her story in the promotional materials and her voice intermittently on the soundtrack, and the money it generated passed to the people who held the rights. She had, in the years before her death, expressed interest in having her story filmed accurately. She had spoken about wanting some control over how she was represented. She had been approached by various producers with various proposals and had been unable to secure an arrangement that gave her meaningful participation in how her story would be told. The arrangement that was eventually made was made after she was gone, when she was no longer in a position to object to what was done with her name. The 70 cents and the several $100s taped to her leg when she was admitted to Metropolitan Hospital are details that have been repeated across decades of writing about her because they carry a weight that is difficult to paraphrase. She had earned significantly. She had been processed by an industry, by managers, by a federal agency, by a legal system, and by the men who moved through her life, taking what they could take, and what remained in her account at the end was 70 cents. The recordings remained. They were being sold the day she died, and they have been sold every day since. Billie Holiday died on July 17, 1959, at Metropolitan Hospital in New York City. The official cause of death was cirrhosis of the liver, complicated by cardiac failure. She was 44 years old. The narcotics charge filed against her while she was hospitalized was still pending. It died with her, unresolved. The Bureau's final action against her concluding not with a verdict, but with an administrative closure. The press coverage of her death was extensive. Obituaries ran in newspapers across the country and in the European press. The coverage returned, with consistency, to the narrative that had structured the public presentation of her life for 2 decades. The extraordinary talent, the self-destruction, the waste. The framing positioned her death as the conclusion of a story whose shape had been visible for years, a story about a woman who had been given a rare gift and had failed to protect it from herself. The structural forces that had shaped her life, the industry's extraction, the Federal Bureau's campaign, the men who had taken her money and her physical safety, appeared in these obituaries in the compressed, backgrounded way that structural forces appear when a narrative has already decided what the story is about. Harry Anslinger, reached for comment by at least one journalist, said nothing of substance. He had moved from the Bureau of Narcotics earlier that year. The file his bureau had maintained on her for 20 years was not mentioned in the obituaries. It would not become a matter of public record for decades when researchers working through declassified documents began to reconstruct the extent of the Bureau's organized campaign against her. Louis Mackay arranged her funeral. It was held at the Church of St. Paul the Apostle on Columbus Avenue in Manhattan, a large Catholic church that could accommodate the number of people who came. Several thousand people attended or stood outside. Musicians were present. People who had heard her in clubs were present. People who had never seen her perform but knew her recordings were present. She had been a public figure for 25 years, and the public came to mark her death in numbers that the people who had managed her finances apparently had not consistently considered when making decisions about what she was owed. She was buried at St. Raymond's Cemetery in the Bronx, in a plot near her mother, Sadie Fagan, who had died in 1945. The grave was marked. Mackay moved in the months and years following her death to consolidate the rights he had positioned himself to claim. He held himself out as the administrator of her estate and as the controlling party for licensing her name and likeness. The estate had no money, but her recordings were being sold, and her name was generating the kind of ongoing commercial interest that attaches to significant artists after their deaths. The structure of who owned what. The masters at Columbia, the masters at Decca, the masters at Verve, the rights to her memoir, the rights to her name and image, was a web of claims that Mackay navigated with an eye toward his own position within it. The Columbia recordings were reissued and repackaged repeatedly across the 1960s. The Verve recordings circulated in various compilations. Strange Fruit was licensed, covered, referenced, and discussed with a frequency that increased rather than decreased as the years passed, and the civil rights movement brought the history it described into a different kind of focus for American audiences. The song that had made her a target of federal surveillance in 1939 became, in the decades after her death, one of the most discussed protest songs in American musical history. The people who had punished her for singing it were not asked to reckon with that history in any formal way. The 1972 film Lady Sings the Blues arrived 13 years after her death and reintroduced her story to a mass audience that had not been alive during her career, or had known her only as a name. The film was not her story in any rigorous sense. It was a story that used her name and some of the broad outlines of her biography as the framework for a Hollywood narrative with different priorities: dramatic compression, romantic coherence, a redemptive arc. The details it changed were not small: the nature of her addiction, the role of specific people in her life, the circumstances of her arrests, the texture of what the music industry had done to her financially. The film was sympathetic in tone and inaccurate in substance, which is a combination that produces a specific kind of distortion. It tells an audience that they now know something about a person while giving them a version of that person that has been reshaped to fit a different story's requirements. The film's success renewed commercial interest in her recordings. The people who held the rights benefited. The people who had held the rights when she was alive had not consistently been the people who had protected her interests when she was alive to have interests. Jimmy Fletcher, the black federal agent who had surveilled her for Anslinger's bureau in the late 1930s and 1940s, gave interviews in his retirement in which he described the surveillance with a complexity that was unusual for a man describing his own professional actions. He said he had liked her. He said she had been kind to him when he attended her performances, not knowing who he was. He said he had continued to file reports. He said in one interview that he thought the Bureau had been wrong to pursue her. He said this several decades after the surveillance, when she had been dead for years and the Bureau's actions could no longer be altered by his assessment of them. John Hammond lived until 1987. He wrote a memoir in which he discussed his role in her early career with the confidence of someone who had done more good than harm. His accounting of the financial arrangements that had governed her recordings was not a central concern of the memoir. He had discovered a great talent. He had brought it to a wider audience. In his own assessment of his life's work, this was the frame that mattered. The recordings are still being sold. Her voice is available on every platform that sells music. in compilations and individual tracks and remastered collections that have been assembled and reassembled across 60 years. Each sale generates a royalty that moves through a chain of ownership that traces back to arrangements made when she was alive and had no meaningful power to contest them, and to arrangements made after her death by people who had not protected her when protection was what she needed. She sang Strange Fruit for the last time at a documented public performance in 1959, a few months before her hospitalization. The audience that heard it that night heard the same words that Meeropol had written in 1937, the same words she had carried for 20 years, in a voice that had been altered by everything that had altered her. The people who had tried to stop her from singing it were gone or retired or had moved to other positions. The song was still there. Billie Holiday has been dead for 65 years. Her voice is easier to access now than it was at any point during her lifetime. A person with a phone can hear Strange Fruit in the time it takes to find it, which is seconds. The infrastructure that makes this possible generates revenue that flows through ownership chains she did not establish and could not have altered. What she left is the sound. What was left to her was 70 cents. The distance between those two facts has not been explained by any of the institutions that created it. Columbia Records has not explained it. The Federal Bureau of Narcotics, which was dissolved and reorganized into the Drug Enforcement Administration in 1973, has not explained it. The New York Police Department, which denied her cabaret card application repeatedly across 11 years, has not explained it. Louis McKay died in 1981. He did not explain it. The biographical industry that has grown around her since her death has produced books, documentaries, academic papers, and the 1972 film that bears her name without accurately representing her life. Each of these has generated something: money, attention, cultural prestige, from the material of what she experienced. The experience itself was hers alone to carry. There is a photograph taken at a recording session in the late 1930s, during the period when the Columbia sessions with Lester Young and Teddy Wilson were producing the recordings that would eventually be considered among the most significant in American music. She is standing at a microphone. She is not performing. The photograph appears to have been taken between takes. She is looking at something outside the frame. The musicians around her are talking, checking their instruments, doing the ordinary things that people do when they are briefly not working. She is still. The expression is the same one visible in photographs taken 20 years later, in the lobby of the benefit concert in 1958, and in photographs taken at various points across her career when someone caught her between the performance and the preparation for the next one. It is not readable as happiness or unhappiness. It is the expression of someone who has been doing something very difficult for a very long time, and who understands with a clarity that does not require articulation exactly what the doing of it has cost. She was asked in an interview sometime in the 1950s what she wanted. The answer she gave was practical. She wanted her cabaret card back. She wanted to work in New York. She wanted to be paid what she was owed. These were not metaphysical desires. They were the specific, concrete things that had been taken from her by specific, identifiable mechanisms, and she named them as such. Nobody gave them back. What remains is the question that her life keeps asking without resolving, not what she could have been, but what was done, by whom, and whether the people and institutions that did it have ever been required to account for it in any terms other than the ones they chose for themselves. The recordings play on. The question sits underneath them, unanswered, the way certain notes sit at the end of a phrase she would leave unresolved. Not because the resolution did not exist, but because leaving it open was the more honest thing to do.